When son humiliates elderly mom on a crowded bus, the air grows heavy with silence. Passengers avert their eyes, unwilling to step in. But then, Big Shaq speaks, his voice calm, unshaken, yet carrying the weight of a storm. Son, you ever been punched by time? In that moment, the ride takes a turn no one expects, and before it's over, one lesson will change everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun painted golden streaks over the city skyline, its warmth barely touching the cold tension inside the crowded city bus. People shuffled into their seats, some scrolling through their phones, others staring out the window, lost in their thoughts. The hum of the engine, the rhythmic squeak of worn-out handrails, the occasional cough, it was a typical weekday ride. Big Shaq sat near the middle, his broad frame making the seat feel smaller than it was. Despite his wealth, despite the multi-million-dollar empire he had built, he preferred this, the raw, unfiltered presence of everyday people. No VIP treatment, no tinted windows, just life as it was. He adjusted his cap and exhaled, watching as a well-dressed man in his mid-30s, sharp suit, crisp tie, an expensive watch that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, sat stiffly next to an elderly woman. She was frail, her thin hands trembling as she clutched her worn-out purse. Her face, lined with time, held a quiet warmth, but her eyes flickered with unease. The bus lurched forward. The young man sighed loudly. His phone buzzed, and with a practiced motion he answered in a clipped, irritated tone. Yeah, I know. Look, just move the meeting to 4. No, I don't care what he said, He stopped mid-sentence, glancing sideways at his mother as she adjusted her purse. The movement annoyed him. His jaw tightened. He shifted away, as if proximity alone was an inconvenience. Shaq watched. He didn't say a word, but he saw everything. The old woman struggled to adjust her bag, her fingers trembling as she tried to keep it from touching her son's expensive suit. The young man rolled his eyes. Exaggerated, mocking. God, can you just... His voice dropped, but not enough for the words to go unnoticed. Can you not be so embarrassing right now? The mother's lips pressed together. She didn't fight back. She didn't flinch, didn't argue. She simply adjusted herself as if she was used to this. Shaq's fingers curled around the edge of his seat. He leaned back, his dark eyes scanning the other passengers. They heard it too. A woman across the aisle stole a glance, then quickly looked away. An older man near the front frowned but said nothing. A teenager with headphones lowered the volume on his music, listening. The bus turned a corner, the sunlight flickering through the windows. Shaq kept watching, waiting. The young man sighed again, louder this time, annoyed. He glanced down at his phone, his free hand running through his perfectly styled hair. You didn't have to take the bus, he muttered. I could have just sent you money for a cab. The elderly woman turned her head slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to spend time with you. Shaq felt it. The shift, the way the air inside the bus grew heavier. The son let out a short, bitter laugh. He shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips, but there was no humor in it. Spend time with me? Mom, I have a life. I have work. I have important things to do. I don't have time to babysit you. Shaq's jaw tightened. The mother's fingers gripped her purse a little tighter, knuckles turning white. But still, she didn't snap back. She just sat there, absorbing the words like she'd absorbed them before. The bus hit a pothole, making the windows rattle. A young woman near the front turned slightly, pretending to check her reflection in the glass but really watching. The son continued, voice dripping with irritation. Why do you always do this? You always act like I'm some kind of disappointment when I'm the one paying your damn bills. Silence. It was the kind of silence that lingered, stretched, demanded attention. Even the engine seemed quieter. Shaq turned his head just enough to see the mother's face. She was looking down, eyes focused on nothing. He knew that look. The look of someone who had swallowed her pride for years. The look of someone who had given everything and was made to feel like it wasn't enough. Shaq exhaled slowly. Not yet. Not yet. The young man, now emboldened by his own frustration, shook his head. You wouldn't even be struggling if you had planned your life better. Maybe if you actually worked harder when you were younger, I wouldn't have to pick up after you now." A single tear slipped down the woman's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, discreetly, like she was ashamed of it. Shaq's hands flexed. A deep, silent storm brewed in his chest. The young man glanced around, realizing the bus was now too quiet. He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, as if suddenly aware that people were listening. But no one spoke. Shaq inhaled through his nose, exhaled slowly. Then, finally, he leaned forward. His deep voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "Son, you ever been punched by time?" The young man's eyebrows pulled together in confusion. He turned his head slowly, finally noticing the man behind him. Shaq met his gaze. Calm, unmoving, unshakable. The young man blinked. "What?" Shaq tilted his head slightly, studying him. His voice was even, measured, but there was something in it that made the entire bus lean in. "I asked if you've ever been punched by time," Shaq repeated, his tone like a slow-moving train. Heavy, deliberate, inescapable. The young man frowned, scoffing lightly. "What the hell does that even mean?" Shaq didn't blink. "It means," he said, voice like quiet thunder, "that one day you're gonna wake up, look in the mirror and realize time hit you so hard you never saw it coming." The bus felt smaller. The young man swallowed, shifting slightly. "Man, look, I don't know what you're trying to—" Shaq raised a hand. Not in warning, in patience. "You keep talking to your mother like that," Shaq continued, "and one day, real soon, you're gonna wake up, and she won't be there to talk to at all." The bus felt frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The mother's eyes lifted. Software searching. The son looked away. Shaq kept his gaze locked, steady. "That's when time punches you," Shaq said, voice low. "Right in the damn soul." The young man didn't have a response. For the first time, he had nothing to say. The bus rumbled forward, the city outside continuing as if nothing had changed. But inside that bus, something had shifted. The air was different. Shaq leaned back in his seat, exhaling, watching, waiting, because he knew. This ride wasn't over yet. The young man sat stiffly, adjusting his suit jacket like it was a shield, something that separated him from the rest of the world, especially from the frail woman beside him. His phone was still clutched in his hand, but he wasn't looking at it anymore. Instead, his eyes were locked on his mother, his expression tightening as she struggled to keep her bag from pressing against his expensive suit. His lips curled, irritation turning sharp, dangerous, not with fists, but with words. "I told you not to embarrass me in public." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The weight in his voice cut deeper than volume ever could. His mother flinched, just slightly, just enough for those paying attention to notice. But she didn't defend herself. She absorbed the blow quietly, like she had done it before. Shaq shifted in his seat. He had seen many fights in his life, but this wasn't a fight. This was a slow, painful unraveling of something that should never have been broken in the first place. The young man let out a harsh breath, barely glancing at the other passengers. He wasn't worried about what they thought. In his mind, he was the victim here. "Look at you," he muttered under his breath, but not low enough. "Shaking. Can't even hold your own bag." The woman exhaled, but it wasn't relief. It was defeat. The young man shook his head, his tone shifting from irritation to something worse, mockery. "Why are you even here?" His mother blinked rapidly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if searching for the right words, but knowing none would be enough. The bus felt smaller now, suffocating. Some passengers stared at their laps, pretending they hadn't heard. Others stole glances, eyes flickering between the young man and his mother, then to Shaq, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to step in. Shaq didn't move. Not yet. The young man leaned back, exhaling sharply. He tapped his phone against his knee, restless, agitated, but not with his mother. No, the frustration ran deeper than that. His mother finally spoke, and her voice, soft, pleading, was barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to spend time with you." Shaq closed his eyes for a brief moment, like he could already see what was coming next. The young man scoffed, shaking his head. Then his voice rose, sharp, cutting, cruel. I didn't ask for this. You're a burden. You ruined my life. Silence. Heavy. Thick. The kind that could crush a person if they weren't strong enough to carry it. His mother recoiled, her entire body shrinking inward. She looked small now. The kind of small that wasn't just about size, but about being made to feel unworthy. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but not quick enough. Passengers fidgeted in their seats. Some glanced at Shaq, still waiting, still watching. Shaq's hands curled into fists, not with anger, not with the urge to strike, but with something deeper. He knew this kind of son. He had almost been this kind of son once. The bus jolted, the sudden motion, making some passengers grab onto rails, steady themselves. But Shaq was already steady, because this was the moment. A deep voice cut through the air, sharp and unshaken. You done? The young man turned, frowning. What? Shaq didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. The young man scoffed, rolling his eyes. Stay out of this, man. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his gaze like a weight pressing down. Nah. See? I am in this now. You made sure of that. The young man's shoulders tensed. This isn't your problem. Shaq exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. It's everybody's problem when a man disrespects his mother in front of the world, like she ain't the reason he even exists. The young man let out a short, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. You don't know anything about us. Shaq leaned forward just slightly, enough for his presence to feel like a shadow over the conversation. I know enough. I know she raised you. I know she fed you, clothed you, made sure you didn't end up in a ditch somewhere when you were too young and too dumb to know better. I know she's sitting here, crying, and you ain't even flinching. The bus was silent. The young man opened his mouth to argue, but Shaq didn't stop. You want to know what else I know? Shaq asked, his voice lower now, heavier. I know you think you got all the time in the world. The young man frowned. What? You think you got years left to fix this? You think you got time to be a man later? But let me tell you something, kid. Shaq let the silence stretch. Let the weight of his words settle deep into the young man's chest. Time don't give warnings, Shaq said. One day you wake up and it's gone. She's gone. And you'll be sitting somewhere staring at an empty chair, realizing this was your last shot to do better. The young man's jaw clenched. For the first time Shaq saw it, the crack. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Something inside the young man wavered. The mother wiped her eyes with a shaking hand. She didn't look at her son. She looked at Shaq. And in that moment, he knew she had been waiting for someone to say these things to him. The bus rumbled forward, but inside, time seemed to have stalled. The young man turned away, staring at the floor, his fingers tightening around his phone. Shaq leaned back, exhaling slowly. This wasn't over. Not yet. But he had planted the seed. And now, it was up to the son to decide what he'd do with it. The bus rumbled along, but inside, it might as well have been frozen. The weight of Shaq's presence had shifted the air, thickening the silence that followed his words. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The young man blinked, his irritation flickering into something else. Something almost hesitant, but he caught himself before it showed. His face twisted into a smirk, dismissive, arrogant. He tilted his head slightly, as if challenging the man who had just interrupted him. He scoffed. Mind your business. Shaq didn't blink, didn't shift. His deep voice came slow, steady, unshaken. I am, Shaq said. This is all our business. A few passengers stirred, eyes darting between them. The young man let out a short, sharp laugh, shaking his head. He leaned back against his seat, tapping his phone against his knee. What, you gonna preach to me now? He sneered. You don't know my life. Shaq smirked, just slightly. But his eyes? His eyes were locked, unrelenting. You ever been punched by time? Shaq asked again. The young man rolled his eyes. Man, what are you even talking about? Shaq leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. His voice didn't rise, didn't waver, but there was something in it that wrapped around the entire bus like a grip tightening. "I'm talking about that moment," Shaq said. "The moment you wake up one day, and everything you thought you had is gone." The words landed heavier than the young man expected. He swallowed, but his pride wouldn't let him show it. Shaq watched him carefully, saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched around his phone. "You think you got time," Shaq continued, his voice low, measured. "You think you got years left to fix this. You think you got another chance to say sorry, to show up, to make things right. But let me tell you something, kid. Time don't send warnings. It just hits. And when it does, it knocks the breath out of you." The young man's jaw clenched. He scoffed again, but it wasn't as sharp this time. "Oh, so now you're some kind of wise man, huh? You think you know everything?" Shaq shook his head, slow and deliberate. "I don't know everything, but I know this. I know that the way you're talking to your mother right now, that's gonna haunt you." The young man let out a sharp breath through his nose, shaking his head. His voice had an edge to it now, defensive, irritated. But underneath, something else was creeping in. "You don't know us, man. You don't know what she put me through." Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "Then tell me." The young man hesitated. The way Shaq said it, it wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a trap. It was an open door. For a second, just a second, it looked like the young man might actually say something. But then his pride took control again. He shook his head, laughing bitterly. "Man, forget this. I don't owe you an explanation." Shaq nodded, as if he expected that answer. He glanced toward the elderly woman. She hadn't spoken again, but her hands were trembling in her lap. Shaq exhaled slowly, looking back at the young man. "You ever heard the sound of an empty house?" Shaq asked. The young man frowned. "What?" Shaq's voice dropped lower. "The sound a house makes when you walk in, and nobody's there anymore." The young man shifted uncomfortably. "You ever walk past a chair at the dinner table?" Shaq continued, "and feel like someone's supposed to be sitting there, but they ain't?" The bus was silent again. Shaq leaned back. "That's what time does," he said. "It don't care how much money you make. It don't care how busy you are. It don't care about your excuses. It just takes." The young man swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around his phone. His leg bounced slightly, a restless energy, something inside him unsettled now. Shaq didn't break eye contact. "You think this don't matter," Shaq said. "You think you'll just fix it later. But what if later never comes?" The young man's throat bobbed as he swallowed again, but he quickly masked it with another scoff. "Man, whatever. You don't know what it's like." Shaq tilted his head. "Don't I?" The young man gave him a look, challenging. "Yeah, you don't." Shaq exhaled, slow. "Let me tell you something," he said. "I had a moment just like this once. A moment where I thought I had all the time in the world." He let the silence stretch before adding, "Then the phone rang." The young man frowned. "What?" Shaq nodded. "Yeah." The phone rang. And on the other end of it, it was too late. The young man shifted again, this time noticeably uncomfortable. He was fighting something now, something inside himself. Shaq studied him for a second before saying, "You think about that next time you open your mouth to talk to your mother like she's nothing." The young man pressed his lips together. He wasn't scoffing anymore. The bus hit another bump in the road. The ride continued, but something had shifted. Shaq had planted the seed. Now it was only a matter of time before it grew. Conversations had stopped. The usual clatter of movement had stilled. All eyes were flickering between Big Shaq and the young man, though most passengers tried to look like they weren't watching. Shaq didn't move much. He didn't have to. His presence alone filled the space between them, a gravity that couldn't be ignored. The young man sat stiffly, his arms crossed, his jaw set. But there was something else now, something that wasn't there before. The defiance was still in his eyes, but underneath it, there was uncertainty. A crack. A hesitation. Shaq let the silence breathe before he spoke again, his voice steady, measured. "You remind me of someone," he said. The young man scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah?" Who? Shaq exhaled through his nose, slow and deep. Then he leaned forward just slightly. A kid, he said. A cocky little kid who thought he was bigger than life. The young man smirked, but his fingers curled slightly on his lap. Shaq caught that. This kid? Shaq continued, his voice smooth but firm. He had talent. He had drive. But he also had a damn ego the size of the city. Thought he had the world figured out. Thought he didn't owe nobody nothing. Shaq let his words settle, watching the young man's reaction. He wasn't pushing. He was pulling. The young man shifted slightly in his seat. Sounds like a smart kid, he muttered. Shaq let out a soft chuckle, but there was no humor in it. That's what he thought too, Shaq said. The bus hit a small bump, jostling some of the passengers, but no one spoke. No one interrupted. This kid, Shaq went on, he had a mother who worked 2 jobs. A mother who came home late, feet aching, hands cracked from scrubbing floors. A mother who skipped meals so he could eat, wore the same shoes for years so he could have new ones. The young man swallowed, but he tried to cover it up by tilting his head, pretending he wasn't listening. Shaq didn't stop. His voice didn't rise, but there was something in it now. Something that made the air feel heavier. And you know what this kid did? Shaq asked. The young man didn't respond. Shaq's expression didn't change. He forgot. The young man blinked. He got big, Shaq said. Got money. Got success. Started thinking he made it all on his own. Started acting like he was the one who did all the work. Like he was the one who built himself from the ground up. The young man's fingers twitched around his phone, but he didn't look at it. Didn't check the time. Didn't scroll. He was listening. Shaq leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. One day that kid got rich, thought he made it, thought he did it alone. The bus was dead silent. The tension between them wasn't just thick, it was suffocating. The young man tried to hold onto his smirk, but it wasn't as strong now. There was something behind his eyes, something flickering. Shaq saw it. He knew what was coming next. He let out a slow breath, his voice like quiet thunder. Then he got the call. The young man frowned slightly. What call? Shaq's jaw tightened. The one that told him she was gone. The words landed like a punch to the chest. The young man's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For the first time, he didn't have something smart to say. Shaq didn't blink. Didn't break eye contact. She was gone, he repeated. And suddenly, all the time in the world wasn't enough. The young man's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. He tried to look away, but something held him there, trapped in Shaq's words. Shaq exhaled, slow. You don't realize it when it's happening, he said. You don't realize how fast it's slipping through your fingers. 1 second you're telling yourself you'll make it up to her later. The next, there is no later. The young man blinked rapidly, his jaw tightening. That's not the same. Shaq raised a brow, studying him. The young man ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking restless. I mean, it's not like she's not dying, okay? I mean, she's fine. She's just... He trailed off. Shaq waited. Let the silence sit there, pressing against the young man's chest. The young man exhaled, shaking his head. She's not perfect, he muttered. You act like she's some kind of saint, but you don't know. You don't know what she's done. Shaq nodded slowly, leaning back. You're right. I don't. The young man blinked. He wasn't expecting that. But let me ask you something, Shaq said. What did she do? The young man opened his mouth, then closed it again. Shaq tilted his head slightly. She beat you? She throw you out on the street? She starve you? The young man looked away, staring out the window. No, he muttered. Shaq nodded. Then what? The young man's leg bounced restlessly. She just makes me feel like I'm never enough, okay? Like no matter what I do, it's not good enough for her. Like I owe her something just for existing. Shaq let the words settle, then exhaled slowly. She ever tell you that? He asked. Or is that just what you tell yourself? The young man didn't answer. Shaq nodded to himself. He could see it now. The real problem. the wound buried under all that arrogance. "Look," Shaq said. "Nobody's perfect. Parents ain't perfect. They mess up, they do things wrong. But let me tell you something, you only get one mother. You only get one shot to get this right." The young man swallowed hard. Shaq's voice softened, just slightly. "You got time now, but it don't last." The bus slowed as they approached another stop. The young man didn't move, didn't reach for his phone, didn't roll his eyes. He was just sitting there, thinking. Shaq leaned back in his seat. He wasn't expecting an answer. Not yet. But he knew one thing for sure. The lesson had begun. The young man sat rigidly, staring out the window, but he wasn't looking at anything in particular. His reflection in the glass showed something he didn't like. A flicker of doubt in his own eyes. His fingers twitched, restless, curling and uncurling around the edge of his phone. It was an unconscious movement, but Shaq saw it. He saw everything. The mother sat beside him, her small frame hunched inward, like she was trying to take up less space. She wiped her eyes discreetly, her hands trembling slightly. Shaq watched, but he wasn't just looking. He was studying. The young man's breathing had changed, shallower, uneven. His shoulders were tense, but not in defiance anymore. This was different. This was conflict. The war wasn't between Shaq and the son. It wasn't even between the son and his mother. It was inside him now. Shaq leaned back slightly, but his eyes stayed locked on the young man. His voice, when it came, was slow, deliberate. "You still got time," Shaq said. "But you're wasting it." The young man's jaw clenched. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head like he could physically shake off Shaq's words. But he couldn't. Shaq kept his voice steady, unshaken. "One day, you're gonna be sitting where I am," Shaq continued. "And the only voice you're gonna hear is regret." The words hit. The young man's posture stiffened for a second before he let out a sharp breath through his nose, like a bull ready to charge. He turned suddenly, his face twisted with frustration. "You don't get it, man," the young man snapped. "You don't know what it's like having someone breathing down your neck your whole life, telling you what to do, what to be, acting like you owe them just because they brought you into this world." His voice cracked on the last few words. Shaq didn't react, didn't flinch. He let the words settle, let the frustration breathe. The young man leaned back against the seat, shaking his head, running a hand through his hair. His breathing was uneven, the emotion starting to push through the cracks in his control. The mother turned her head slightly, looking at her son with an expression too complicated to name. A mix of sadness, understanding, and something else. Something that had been buried for years. Shaq nodded slowly. He had seen this before. He knew this stage, the moment where the anger starts turning inward. "You ever notice," Shaq said, voice steady, "that the people who love you the most, they're the ones you hurt the easiest?" The young man swallowed, his gaze flickering toward Shaq before looking away again. Shaq continued. "You say she's breathing down your neck, holding you back. But let me ask you something. If she walked away right now, forever, would you still feel free? Or would you feel lost?" The young man exhaled sharply, looking away again, his fingers tightening around his phone. Shaq didn't stop. "You got this idea in your head," he said, "that you're trapped, that she's holding on to you. But maybe, just maybe, you're the one holding on to something." The young man's grip on his phone turned white-knuckled. His leg bounced. The restlessness had returned. Shaq watched him carefully. The battle was getting louder inside him. Shaq's voice softened, just slightly. "You mad right now, but not at me." The young man let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "And who the hell am I mad at, then?" Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "Yourself." The bus jolted slightly, making the mother grab onto the rail for balance. The young man instinctively reached out to steady her. It was automatic, reflexive. He realized what he had done a second too late. His hand hovered for a moment before he pulled it back quickly, clearing his throat, trying to pretend it didn't happen. But Shaq saw it. So did his mother. Shaq leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You love her," Shaq said simply. "That's why it hurts." The young man didn't respond, but he wasn't fighting as hard anymore. Shaq let the silence stretch before adding, "You ever wonder why you get so angry? Why it's so personal? It's because deep down you know you're being unfair. And that's a tough thing to face." The young man exhaled, shaking his head, but it wasn't sharp this time. The mother watched her son quietly, eyes glassy, but she didn't say anything. Not yet. Shaq sat back, letting the weight of everything settle. The bus slowed as they neared another stop. A few passengers got off, but the young man stayed. He didn't move, didn't shift in his seat. Shaq knew he wasn't done yet. "You ever lost somebody?" Shaq asked suddenly. The young man frowned. "What?" Shaq's gaze didn't waver. "You ever lost somebody? Somebody you loved?" The young man swallowed. His tongue darted out to wet his lips. "Yeah," he muttered. Yeah, a friend, couple years back." Shaq nodded. "You ever think about them?" The young man hesitated. "Yeah." Shaq tilted his head slightly. "You ever wish you had more time?" The young man didn't answer right away. His breathing changed again. Slower now, less controlled. Shaq let the silence do its work. Then finally, the young man exhaled. Something in him had shifted just slightly. "Yeah," he admitted. "I do." Shaq nodded again, slow and knowing. "Now, imagine waking up tomorrow and she's gone." The young man flinched. His head turned slightly toward his mother, but he caught himself before his eyes met hers. His mother saw it anyway. Shaq's voice dropped lower. "You wouldn't be able to take back a single word," Shaq said. "Not one. Not the ones you meant, and not the ones you didn't." The young man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He was gripping his phone so tightly now, his knuckles had gone pale. For the first time, he looked scared. Not of Shaq, not of his mother. Of himself. The bus kept moving forward, but inside, everything felt different. Shaq sat back, watching him carefully. The young man wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but Shaq could tell. The first crack had finally formed. The bus screeched to a stop at the next intersection, its brakes letting out a long, tired sigh. The doors hissed open, letting in the cold morning air and the sound of distant traffic. A few passengers stepped off, while others shuffled into the newly emptied seats. Among them was a gray-haired man, his shoulders slightly hunched, his step slow but steady. His face was lined with the kind of exhaustion that life carves into people who have seen too much. Shaq barely glanced at him at first, still focused on the young man sitting stiffly beside his mother. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, lingering tension. The young man had stopped arguing, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The gray-haired man moved toward an open seat across from them. He adjusted his coat, settling in with a slow exhale, as if he had been carrying a weight for far too long. Then his eyes landed on the elderly woman beside the young man. For a second, he didn't move. Didn't blink. His expression shifted. Shock first, then something deeper. Something raw. The woman, still lost in her own thoughts, didn't notice right away. But the weight of his stare must have reached her because she finally looked up. Her breath caught. Recognition. "Oh my," her voice barely above a whisper. "Robert?" The man swallowed thickly, his throat bobbing. His voice when he spoke was rough with disbelief. "Sarah?" The entire bus seemed to pause. Shaq's head tilted slightly, watching as the elderly woman's eyes glistened with something between surprise and sorrow. The young man frowned, his irritation flickering into confusion. He looked between his mother and the old man, searching for an explanation. "Wait, what?" His tone was sharp, defensive. "Who is this?" The woman blinked rapidly, as if trying to make sense of a ghost sitting right in front of her. She hesitated, her hands tightening over her purse. Then softly, she spoke. "Your father's best friend." The young man's entire body stiffened. The weight in the air shifted, like a door had just been opened to a room that had been locked for decades. Shaq straightened slightly, his instincts sharpening. He knew when a story was about to unfold. The young man scoffed, but it wasn't his usual arrogance. This time it was nervous, defensive. "What do you mean, Dad's best friend?" he asked, shaking his head. I don't I've never seen this guy before in my life. The elderly man, Robert, exhaled, rubbing his hands together slowly, like he was trying to warm them up. Or maybe, trying to steady himself. That doesn't surprise me, Robert said, his voice carrying a weight of regret. Your father and I, we lost touch a long time ago. Sarah looked down at her lap, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted her bag. The young man shook his head again, his confusion turning into frustration. So what? He was just some old friend from the past? He turned to his mother. Why does it look like you've seen a damn ghost? Sarah inhaled deeply. When she lifted her eyes, they weren't just looking at Robert. They were looking at memories. Shaq could see it, the way she seemed to be caught between the past and the present, as if part of her had been transported back to another time, another life. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but firm. Because I thought he was dead. The young man's head snapped back like he'd been slapped. The bus felt smaller now. Robert swallowed hard. I thought you knew. Sarah shook her head slowly. I had no idea. Shaq's gaze flickered between them, taking in every detail. The way Robert's hands clenched together. The way Sarah's lips trembled. The way the young man sat perfectly still, his fingers gripping his knee. The young man let out a sharp breath. Okay, hold on. Can someone explain what the hell is going on? Robert sighed, rubbing his forehead. His voice was lower now, carrying the weight of something buried deep. Your father and I, Robert started. We were closer than brothers. We grew up together. We had plans. Big ones. We were going to start a business together, build something real. But life had other plans. The young man's jaw clenched. He hated stories like this. Stories about the past, about choices made before he was even born. They always came with excuses. So what happened? He asked, voice sharp. Robert hesitated, glancing at Sarah. It was her story too. She took a breath, then spoke. Your father, he wasn't the man you think he was, Sarah said softly. He wasn't selfish. He wasn't weak. The young man's face darkened. That was exactly how he had always thought of his father. A man who left them struggling, a man who didn't provide enough. What are you talking about? He muttered. Robert looked at him now, his tired eyes holding something heavy. Your father. He gave up everything for you, Robert said. The young man's head jerked slightly. Lies, he muttered. Sarah shook her head. No. The young man let out a bitter laugh. Yeah? Then why did we struggle so much? Why was there never enough money? Why? Because he was protecting us, Sarah interrupted, her voice trembling. Because he didn't want you to grow up carrying his burdens. Shaq saw the young man's hands tighten into fists, his entire body tense. Robert exhaled. Your father got mixed up in something he thought would set you all up for life. Sarah closed her eyes. But it didn't. Robert nodded. He lost everything. And instead of dragging you down with him, he let you believe he was just another man who couldn't provide. The young man's breath hitched slightly, but his pride wouldn't let him accept it yet. That doesn't make any sense, he muttered. If he loved us so much, why didn't he just tell me? Sarah's eyes shimmered with tears. Because he wanted you to be free from it. Robert looked at her, then at the young man. He made a choice. To let you be angry at him, instead of letting you carry the truth. The young man blinked rapidly. The foundation of everything he had believed about his father was cracking beneath him. Shaq saw it. The way his breathing had changed, the way his shoulders had slumped slightly, like a weight had suddenly been placed on them. He was seeing his father for the first time, not as a failure, but as a man. The young man swallowed hard, his voice quieter now. Why are you telling me this now? Robert's lips pressed into a thin line. Because, Robert said, I couldn't live with myself if I died with this truth. The words landed heavy. The young man's hands loosened, his fingers twitching. Sarah reached out, hesitating for a second before placing a hand over her son's. This time, he didn't pull away. The bus jolted slightly as it kept moving forward, but inside, something had changed. Shaq exhaled slowly. He had been right. This ride wasn't just about a lesson. It was about truth. And sometimes, Truth changed everything. Robert sat with his hands clasped together, staring down at his knuckles, his fingers trembling slightly. Across from him, Sarah sat silent, her face lined with emotions too complex to name. And between them, the young man sat frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. His whole life, he had believed one thing: his father had been a failure. A man who hadn't provided enough. A man who had left them struggling while the world moved forward. But now, that belief was crumbling. Sarah took a slow breath, looking down at her lap. "I never wanted you to hate him," she said softly. "But I also never wanted you to carry his mistakes. So I let you believe what was easier." The young man's head snapped up, his expression unreadable. Easier? His voice was quieter than before, but there was something behind it, something raw. "You think it was easier for me to grow up thinking he didn't care?" Sarah's lips parted, but no words came out. Robert exhaled, rubbing his jaw. His tired eyes met the young man's, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. "Your father loved you," Robert said. "More than anything." The young man scoffed, but it wasn't as sharp as before. There was hesitation now, a crack in his resistance. "Yeah?" His voice was tight. "Then why did he let us live like that? Why did we have to scrape by while he, what? Sat back and watched?" Sarah's breath hitched, her fingers gripping the strap of her purse. Robert shook his head. He didn't sit back. He was fighting a battle you never saw. The young man clenched his jaw. "What does that even mean?" Robert leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. His voice was heavy, steady, final. "It means that your father took on a debt he could never pay back," Robert said. "Not just money, not just business. He owed people favors, the kind you don't walk away from." The young man frowned, his hands tightening into fists. "Debt?" Sarah's eyes shimmered. She turned toward her son, her voice trembling. "Your father was trying to build something for you," she whispered. "Something that would last. A business, a future. But he trusted the wrong people. He borrowed from men who don't forgive mistakes." The bus felt smaller, the walls pressing in. The young man blinked rapidly, like he was trying to clear the fog in his mind. "So, what? He lost the money?" Robert exhaled. "No." The young man's stomach tightened. "Then what?" Robert's face hardened. "He lost himself." Silence. Deep, suffocating silence. The young man shook his head. No, that's not..." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "You're telling me my father got involved with criminals?" Robert didn't blink. "Yes." Sarah closed her eyes, pressing her lips together. The young man's chest felt tight. "And you?" He turned to his mother, his voice shaking. "You knew?" Sarah inhaled sharply but nodded. "I knew." He let out a sharp breath, his world spinning. He had spent his whole life thinking his father was weak, a disappointment. But now the truth was something he never could have expected. The air in the bus grew thick, suffocating. Passengers weren't speaking, but they were listening, watching. Shaq studied the young man, his expression unreadable. He could see the moment the truth started sinking in. The young man's hands trembled slightly. He rubbed them against his pants, trying to steady himself. But the weight of what he had just heard was crushing him. Sarah swallowed hard. "I tried to protect you from it," she said. "I didn't want you to grow up afraid. I didn't want you to feel like you had to carry his choices." The young man let out a shaky breath. "So instead you let me hate him." Sarah flinched. Robert leaned back, his tired eyes flickering with regret. "He made his choice, son," he said. "He knew what he was doing. He knew he might not make it out. But the one thing he never wanted was for you to pay for his mistakes." The young man felt like he couldn't breathe. His father hadn't abandoned them. He had sacrificed everything to make sure they were safe. And all this time, he had blamed the wrong person. He turned toward his mother, seeing her differently now. The lines on her face weren't just from age. They were from years of carrying a truth too heavy to speak. She had kept this secret so he wouldn't grow up bitter, so he wouldn't feel trapped by a past he had no part in. But in doing so, she had let him build a lie in his heart. His breath shuddered. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah's voice cracked. "Because I didn't want you to live in his shadow." The young man exhaled, shaking his head, trying to process everything. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers. They felt numb. The bus rumbled forward. But inside, everything had stopped. Shaq, still silent, watched carefully. He had seen men break before, but this was something else. This was a son realizing his entire foundation had been built on sand. The young man clenched his jaw, forcing himself to swallow the lump in his throat. He wanted to be angry, wanted to lash out. But for the first time, he didn't know who to be angry at. His father? For keeping him in the dark? His mother? For letting him grow up hating a man who died for him? Or himself? For never asking the right questions? His vision blurred slightly, but he blinked the feeling away. He wasn't ready. Not yet. But he was close. Shaq, watching it all unfold, finally spoke. His voice was steady, knowing. "The truth don't change what happened," Shaq said. "But it changes what you do next." The young man inhaled shakily. Because Shaq was right. The past couldn't be rewritten. But the future? That was still his to decide. The bus slowed, its brakes letting out a long, tired sigh as it pulled up to the next stop. The doors hissed open, the cold morning air rushing inside. A few passengers shuffled toward the exit, stepping off without a second thought, moving on with their day. But inside, at the center of it all, the young man didn't move. He sat frozen, his fingers gripping his phone tightly, his breathing uneven. The weight of everything he had just learned pressed down on his chest like an anchor. His mother exhaled softly beside him. It wasn't a sigh of relief or exhaustion. It was acceptance. She reached for her purse, her movement slow, almost hesitant. She adjusted the strap over her shoulder, preparing to stand. Shaq, still seated across from them, watched the young man closely, his expression unreadable, his presence unshaken. Then, he spoke. "This is it, kid," Shaq said, his voice deep, firm. "Your move." The young man flinched. His head snapped toward Shaq, his eyes flashing with something raw, anger, resistance, fear. But Shaq didn't look away. The young man turned back to his mother, his gaze flickering over her small frame, her tired hands, her aging face. The face he had looked at his entire life, but never truly seen. His chest tightened. His ego screamed at him to stay put, to let her go, to pretend none of this had affected him. But something deeper, something he had buried for years, was clawing its way to the surface. For the first time, he saw her. Not as an obligation, not as someone holding him back, not as a burden, but as his mother. She turned slightly, still gripping her bag, preparing to step off the bus alone. His breath hitched. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he moved. He stood, fast, abrupt, almost like a reflex. His mother turned, startled, looking up at him with wide eyes. He reached out, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then grabbed the handle of her bag. "I got it, Ma." The words left his lips before he even realized he had spoken them. The entire bus exhaled. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't a cheer. But it was there. A quiet, invisible shift in the air, like something that had been pulled too tight had finally loosened. His mother blinked rapidly, her lips parting slightly. Her hands hovered near the strap of her purse, as if she didn't quite know what to do. Then, her eyes filled with tears. But this time, they were different. Not tears of pain, not of disappointment, but of relief. Shaq nodded once, slow, a silent acknowledgement, a moment between men. The young man swallowed hard, his throat tight, but he didn't let go of the bag. For the first time in a long, long time, he didn't feel trapped. He didn't feel controlled. He just felt right. The bus doors remained open, waiting. His mother sniffled softly, reaching out, not for the bag, but for him. She squeezed his wrist just once. No words. None were needed. He gave a small, shaky nod. Then, together, they stepped off the bus. The doors closed behind them. And inside, Shaq leaned back in his seat, watching them disappear into the city. Another stop. Another day. But for that young man, everything had changed. The bus doors hissed shut behind them, sealing the moment like the final page of a book. The mother and son stepped onto the sidewalk together, moving into the flow of the city. This time, he didn't walk ahead of her. He walked beside her. Shaq watched them through the window as the bus pulled away from the curb. His eyes tracked their movements. The mother, still wiping away stray tears, and the son, his posture different now. Less stiff, less distant. A few passengers murmured among themselves, shifting in their seats. Some wiped at their eyes discreetly, pretending it was just the dust from the city air slipping through the cracked windows. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing, lost in their own thoughts. Something had changed. Not just for the young man and his mother. For everyone who had witnessed it. The weight of what had just happened still lingered, filling the bus like an unspoken understanding between strangers. A reminder. A lesson. Shaq exhaled, slow and steady, leaning back into his seat. The familiar rhythm of the city pulsed around him. The hum of the engine, the distant honking of impatient drivers, the faint chatter of people moving through their lives outside. Another stop. Another day. But some days meant more than others. The bus rumbled forward, past familiar streets, past old buildings and neon-lit signs that had seen 1,000 stories unfold beneath them. Shaq let his gaze wander, taking it all in, but his mind was elsewhere. He had seen men like that young man before, too proud to admit their pain, too blind to see what was slipping through their fingers. And he had seen too many of them wake up one day when it was already too late. Not today. Today, the story had been different. The bus turned a corner, the movement rocking the passengers slightly. An older woman near the front adjusted her purse, her lips pursed in quiet thought. A man in a construction vest tapped his fingers against his knee, his expression unreadable. A teenage boy pulled his headphones down around his neck, staring out the window, his face softer now, thoughtful. Shaq saw it, the ripple effect. One moment, one conversation, one lesson. It didn't just change one person. It spread. Maybe that young man wouldn't be the only one walking away with something different in his heart today. Maybe, somewhere down the line, another son would call his mother just to hear her voice. Maybe another daughter would take a deep breath before snapping at her father over something that wouldn't matter in the end. Maybe someone else would sit across from an old man on a bus and finally ask him about his life, instead of scrolling through their phone. Shaq closed his eyes for a second, listening to the steady hum of the wheels rolling against the pavement. Some lessons took years to sink in. Some people had to learn the hard way. But today? Today, at least one man had chosen the right road before it was too late. The bus slowed at another stop, the doors opening again, welcoming a new wave of passengers. New faces, new stories. Shaq didn't need to know them to understand one thing. Everyone was carrying something. Everyone had a moment in their life where they would have to make a choice. Just like that young man. Just like him, once upon a time. The bus moved forward again, the city stretching ahead. Shaq glanced out the window one last time before turning his attention forward, his face unreadable, but knowing. Another lesson. Another day. And the ride continued. Some moments change everything. Some words once spoken can never be taken back. What would you do if tomorrow never came for someone you love? The real question isn't who's right or wrong, it's whether you'll realize what truly matters before it's too late. Because time doesn't wait. And neither should you.